Nancy Guthrie missing day 60. This, as we learned, the FBI tonight trying to reverse engineer what could be two legitimate ransom notes. This amid reports that Mrs. Guthrie's home was found immaculate when her daughter Annie came rushing in. What, if anything, does that mean to CSI, crime scene investigators? Trust me, it means a lot. And tonight, did a dog named Jolene foil the kidnappers' original plan? Good evening. I'm Nancy Grace. This is Crime Stories. I want to thank you for being with us.
400 of them in Iraq. He watched notes go to TMZ instead of the family. He watched 2 deadlines pass with 0 escalation. He watched a $6 million demand arrive with no way for the family to respond. And he said it on record, this is not how kidnapping for ransom works. What he laid out is the part of this case that has never been fully confronted.
They sent the ransom note to TMZ, a tabloid network, and then the local news media. All right, that's not how kidnap for ransom
operated on a single assumption that what happened to Nancy was a kidnapping for ransom, that someone out there is holding her in exchange for money. That assumption has shaped everything. The family's public videos begging for communication, the news coverage tracking ransom deadlines, the way millions of people have been following and processing this case. It has been treated as the baseline reality. For the public watching through their phones and through the news, that assumption made sense. The family posted videos saying they would pay, responding to communications they had received.
We received your message, and we understand. We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her. This is the only way we will have peace. This is very valuable to us, and we will pay.
The FBI was publicly tracking the notes. The deadlines were being reported as real operational events with real consequences approaching. Analysts on television were discussing negotiation strategy, ransom payment protocols, the Bitcoin wallet mechanics of how a transfer might work. Everything about the public presentation of this story pointed toward a kidnapping for ransom in progress. And for a family in anguish responding in real time to communications they believed might be real, that framing was entirely understandable. The question of whether the ransom framing was itself the strategy, whether what presented itself as a kidnapping operation was designed to look like one rather than to operate like one, was not being asked loudly in the early weeks of this case. It was being asked privately by people with the professional background to recognize the difference. But from the very first week of February, someone with more direct real-world hostage negotiation experience than almost anyone who has spoken publicly about this case was raising a very different question on television, in writing, in interview after interview, not whether Nancy was taken. She clearly was. The blood on the front porch is real. The doorbell footage is real. The pacemaker data is real. What this person was questioning is whether the ransom framing was ever real, whether what presented itself to the public as a kidnapping for ransom operation matches a single documented pattern he has spent a career learning. And sign by sign, he laid out why he does not believe it does. Before the signs, you need to understand who is making this assessment and why it carries the weight that it does. Commander Dan O'Shea is a retired U.S. Navy SEAL who served from 2004 to 2006 as the coordinator of the hostage working group at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, Iraq. In that assignment, he personally managed more than 400 hostage incidents, cases involving American journalists, NGO workers, and foreign nationals held by al-Qaeda-affiliated groups, Iraqi insurgents, and criminal kidnapping rings operating in one of the most dangerous environments in modern history. By the time he completed his tour, kidnappings in his operational area had dropped to single digits. He appeared on Fox News, Fox Business, and News Nation analyzing the Nancy.
The moment Nancy Grace began speaking about the case, the tone of the entire discussion changed. What had once been treated as a closed and settled investigation suddenly felt uncertain again. For years, the official report had offered a clear explanation, one that many people accepted without question. But as she carefully walked through the details on air, she pointed to something that didn't sit right, a flaw that most viewers had never even considered. The case itself had already captured public attention long before this moment. When the news first broke, the story spread quickly, and investigators worked fast to piece together what had happened. Their conclusion seemed straightforward, supported by what they believed was solid evidence. Among that evidence, the autopsy report stood as the most definitive account of the victim's final moments. But according to Nancy Grace, that very report might hold the biggest problem. As she revisited the details, she highlighted a specific inconsistency buried deep within the findings. It wasn't something obvious or dramatic. In fact, it was subtle, easy to overlook unless you knew exactly what to look for. Yet once she explained it, the implication became impossible to ignore. If that detail didn't align with the official timeline, then the entire narrative could begin to fall apart. Viewers leaned in closer, realizing that what they were hearing could change everything they thought they knew about the case. Questions that had never been asked before suddenly demanded answers. And if you're drawn to stories like this, where hidden details challenge what we believe to be true, this is the perfect time to subscribe, like the video, and share it with someone who loves uncovering mysteries. Because what Nancy Grace pointed out was only the beginning. The deeper investigators looked into the autopsy evidence, the more unsettling the story became. As the discussion continued, Nancy Grace shifted her focus to a real case that had puzzled investigators and the public for years: the death of Kendrick Johnson. At first glance, authorities ruled it an accident, explaining that the teenager had become trapped inside a rolled-up gym mat while reaching for a shoe. The official autopsy supported that conclusion, stating positional asphyxia as the cause of death. For many, that explanation seemed unusual but possible. However, as Nancy Grace carefully revisited the details, she pointed out something that didn't sit right with her. According to reports, Kendrick's body was found in an upright position, tightly wedged inside the mat. What raised questions was the lack of evidence suggesting a desperate struggle. In situations involving suffocation, there are often signs, scratches, movement, attempts to escape, but those signs appeared limited or unclear in this case. The more she spoke, the more viewers began to question the official narrative. Nancy Grace emphasized that autopsy conclusions rely heavily on context, and if the surrounding circumstances don't fully align, then the findings deserve a second look. She also referenced the family's concerns, noting that they had long believed something more had happened and had even sought independent examinations. As the documentary footage replayed key moments, the timeline of events began to feel less certain. How did Kendrick end up in that position? Was it truly an accident, or was there something investigators missed? If you're following this case closely, now is a good time to like the video and share it with someone who enjoys real unresolved mysteries. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next part of the investigation reveals even more details that challenge what we think we know. Because as more evidence surfaced, it became clear that the autopsy report might not be the final word. It might just be the beginning of deeper questions. As the case of Kendrick Johnson continued to draw attention, more details began to surface, details that made the situation even more difficult to ignore. What once seemed like an unusual but explainable accident was now being re-examined from multiple angles, and each new perspective raised fresh concerns. Nancy Grace pointed out that one of the most troubling aspects of the case was the discrepancy between the original autopsy and the independent examination requested by Kendrick's family. While the official report concluded positional asphyxia, a second autopsy conducted by a private pathologist suggested something very different. According to that report, the cause of death could have been blunt force trauma. This contradiction immediately intensified the mystery. Two professional examinations looking at the same body had reached completely different conclusions. For viewers, it raised a critical question. How could such a significant difference exist in a case that was already considered closed? The documentary carefully walked through both findings, allowing viewers to understand how each conclusion was reached. The official investigation relied heavily on the scene and positioning of the body, while the independent pathologist focused more closely on specific physical findings that they believed pointed to possible injury before death. As these details were presented, the case began to feel far more complex than anyone had initially believed. It was no longer just about how Kendrick died. It was about whether the full truth had ever been uncovered. If you've been following this story, this is the moment where things start to take a deeper turn. Make sure to like the video, share it with someone who enjoys real investigative stories, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because as investigators and independent experts continued digging, another layer of the case began to emerge, one that would challenge not just the autopsy findings, but the entire timeline of events surrounding Kendrick's final moments. As the investigation deepened, attention turned to the scene where Kendrick Johnson was discovered. What initially seemed like a straightforward location, a high school gym, now became one of the most debated aspects of the entire case. The positioning of the body, the layout of the mats, and the surrounding environment all came under intense scrutiny. Nancy Grace emphasized that understanding the physical scene is critical when interpreting any autopsy report. If the environment doesn't fully support the conclusion, then questions naturally follow. In Kendrick's case, investigators stated that he had climbed into the mat to retrieve a shoe and became stuck upside down. But critics of that explanation began asking how such a scenario could occur without clearer signs of movement or disturbance around the area. The documentary carefully reconstructed the scene, showing how the mats were arranged and how narrow the space inside them actually was. Viewers could see just how difficult it would have been for someone to enter that position, and even more difficult to escape. Some experts suggested it was possible, while others believed the scenario raised serious doubts. Another key detail involved surveillance footage from the school. While cameras were present, there were gaps in the footage that left portions of the timeline unaccounted for. This absence of continuous visual evidence only added to the uncertainty, making it harder to fully confirm what happened in Kendrick's final moments. As these pieces came together, the case felt less like a closed investigation and more like an unanswered question waiting to be resolved. If you're finding this case as gripping as it is puzzling, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves real mysteries, and subscribe for more deep investigations like this. Because what comes next would bring even more attention to the autopsy itself, revealing details that would push the controversy to an entirely new level. As the case continued to unfold, the focus returned once again to the autopsy, this time with even greater intensity. What had once been considered the most reliable piece of evidence was now at the center of a growing controversy. The findings surrounding Kendrick Johnson were being questioned not just by the public, but by experts who believed critical details may have been overlooked. Nancy Grace
Guthrie missing day 60. This, as we learned, the FBI tonight trying to reverse engineer what could be two legitimate ransom notes. This amid reports that Mrs. Guthrie's home was found immaculate when her daughter Annie came rushing in. What, if anything, does that mean to CSI, crime scene investigators? Trust me, it means a lot. And tonight, did a dog named Jolene foil the kidnappers' original plan? Good evening. I'm Nancy Grace. This is Crime Stories. I want to thank you for being with us.
Our dogs are usually sound sleepers. Full confession, when the dog woke me up to say, I've got to go outside, I was grudgingly accommodating and took the dog out to our little courtyard in the back of our house. And it was unusual, and it seldom happens.
I mean, from the very early moments, Annie and Tommy were saying this isn't that case that you are used to where someone wanders off. She can't wander off. Mm-hmm. My mom, she was in tremendous pain. Yeah. Her back was very bad. You know, she was trying to, on a good day, she could walk down to the mailbox and get the mail, but most days not. So there was no wander off. And the doors were propped open.
Yeah.
And there was blood on the front doorstep.
That is from our friends at Today on YouTube. And joining us now, special guest Jeff Lemie, Nancy Guthrie's neighbor who passed her often when they would both be out walking in the neighborhood. Jeff Lemie, thank you for joining us again tonight. We are learning the back door was propped open. Recent reports the home was, quote, immaculate. In other words, Nancy Guthrie kept a perfect home. But yet we see, Jeff Lemie, and
Other alternative possibilities had been fully explored before closing the case. Once a case is labeled, it can influence how future evidence is interpreted, making it harder to revisit earlier assumptions. Another layer of the story involved communication between investigators and the family. Concerns were raised about whether all findings had been clearly explained and whether every question had been fully addressed. For the family, the lack of clarity only deepened their belief that more needed to be uncovered. As viewers watched these details unfold, it became clear that this case was no longer just about one moment in time. It was about the entire investigative process and whether it had left important questions unanswered. If you've been following this story, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who's interested in real crime investigations, and subscribe so you don't miss the final chapters. Because what comes next would bring everything together, linking the autopsy, the timeline, and the investigation in a way that could change how the entire case is understood. As the case entered its most critical stage, everything began to converge. The autopsy findings, the timeline, and the questions surrounding the investigation itself. What once seemed like separate concerns were now forming a pattern that was difficult to ignore. For many following the story of Kendrick Johnson, this was the moment where the case felt less like a conclusion and more like an ongoing mystery. Nancy Grace revisited the key issue she had raised from the beginning: the possibility that a single overlooked flaw in the autopsy could influence how every other piece of evidence was interpreted. If the medical conclusion was even slightly off, then the timeline, the scene analysis, and the final ruling could all be affected. The documentary carefully connected each piece of evidence: the positioning of the body in the gym mat, the conflicting autopsy reports, the missing clarity around certain procedures, and the gaps in surveillance footage. All of these elements began to align in a way that raised deeper questions. It wasn't about proving one theory over another, but about understanding whether all possibilities had truly been explored. Experts interviewed in the film emphasized that in complex cases, certainty is not always immediate. Sometimes, it takes years of re-examination for new insights to emerge. And when multiple inconsistencies appear, even if each one seems small, they can collectively point toward the need for further review. For viewers, the tension reached its peak. Everything they had learned so far suggested that the story might not be as simple as it once seemed. If you've stayed with this investigation to this point, now is the perfect time to like this video, share it with someone who follows real crime mysteries, and subscribe for more in-depth stories like this. Because the final chapter would not offer easy answers.